so today I'm going to talk about someone whom I consider to be amongst the greatest of the living authors, and that is Mr. Cormac McCarthy. I rank him tied first with Thomas Pynchon as my absolute favourite. He is a wonderful author whom I consider to have at least four masterpieces, and considering most authors would be happy to have one, the fact that I consider him to have four just shows how much I think of him as a great author. And that is Mr. Cormac McCarthy, who is truly phenomenal. Words cannot describe. So today I'm going to talk my way through his collection. I have every book of his. I have it in the style of the Picador fashion, which is this almost minimalist and maximalist at the same time. I really like them. It took me a while to collect them, but I finally got there. And at the end, I'm going to give myself a personal ranking of them. I haven't read all of them yet, but I will get to it. So without further ado, let's get into it. First one, The Orchard Keeper, released in 1968, which is set in a small remote community in rural Tennessee. You'll find that the first three books of his are set pretty much in the backwoods of the Appalachian Mountains, Tennessee-ish area. And this is where I have a problem, like a small flaw of his work. I consider his earlier stuff to be nowhere near as good, actually, as his later stuff. I tried the first few pages of The Orchard Keeper, and I'm having the same problem with this as I'm doing with other debut novels by other authors whom I really love indeed, including David Foster Wallace's A Broom with a System and Thomas Pynchon's V novels that... I don't know, maybe it's just the prose, maybe it was because it was so early in their career that I'm just not used to what they were writing then compared to what made them such established authors later on. I will get back to V, and I will get back to this. I mean, I started this probably 2 books in with him, but now that I've read a few more, I think I can actually attempt this with a bit more knowledge behind me and with a bit more attention to his prose style, and hopefully get through it. But as it stands, I've not read this, so I can't really say much more about it, but that's The Orchard Keeper. The next is Outer Dark, and the cover art is perfectly designed for that because it is set in the backwoods, it's set in the mountains. It's about a brother and a sister and an illegitimate child, and the brother and sister separate trying to find the child that was left by the brother in the woods. And in between that, you have these 3 almost apocalyptic characters that show up throughout the story, and it leads to this eerie resolution. Almost these elusive strangers where whenever they go, death appears. And that leads to a conclusion which I really liked. I think it was masterfully done. Unfortunately, this is my least favourite of his books, and I think it harks back to the same problems I have with the first few pages of The Orchard Keeper, and that's just his style, his writing style. I didn't resonate with it as much. I didn't really interpret it that well. But even McCarthy's worst stuff is better than a lot of the stuff that is released today. So it's still worth checking out, but I think this is one of those ones where you should read it after reading a few more of his other books first. So that's the second part of his Southern Gothic trilogy. That's Outer Dark. Next one is Child of God, my favourite of the 3 from this period of time. Don't check out the movie. The movie is not good. James Franco directed it, but do read the book. It is a quick read. It's based on 3 or 4 parts, and it's sort of structured very loosely. It's this character study of a man named Lester Ballard, who is violent, solitary, and introverted, and who is pushed to the edges of humanity by a community itself. And it's actually a very sad story. And basically, it sort of teaches. It doesn't really teach you, but it leads you to sympathize with a monster that was created by society. So I think there is this form of brilliance in an author being able to get you to sympathize with someone like that, and it is one amongst his, well, it's not amongst his, it's his most slimmest novel. And if you were to start with McCarthy, this is one of the ones I point to. I always point to one from his Western era, one from his Southern Gothic era, and one from his later period, which we'll get to later. So yeah, do give this one a shot. Out of the 3 that I've talked about just now, this is the one I recommend the most. And that leads us to this bad boy, the combination of those 3 books into Suttree, which some say is semi-autobiographical. There is no plot structure, rather it follows a few years in the life of protagonist Cornelius Suttree, who is living alone and in exile on a houseboat in the middle of the filthy Tennessee River by Knoxville. And it's the story is filled with eccentrics, poverty-stricken people. It's filled with bar owners, witch doctors, you name it. Anyone and anything is filled in this book. But it is filled with dignity. It is filled with humor. It is the funniest of his books. And there's this hilarious character called Harrogate, and his story arc leads to a pretty sad conclusion. I mean, I was almost in tears reading about it, because his plot throughout the book is just all about these get-rich-quick schemes. And the main character himself is one of the few out of any McCarthy book that you'll want to connect with. It's also the only book that comes close to having a happy ending. The only McCarthy book that does have a happy ending, I actually think. It leaves you with a smile on your face. So this one I rank really highly. It is also a very thick book. It's a long read. It's filled with $1,000 words, very Faulknerian. So I do not recommend starting with this one first. But when you work your way up to it, and when you finally do get reading it, you'll see how much of a treasure this one is. So that is a great book. Released in 1979, so there was a 6-year period between Child of God, which was 1973, and this one here, 1979. And that leads us to the monster, the one that Harold Bloom called the greatest living book since Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, and that is Blood Meridian. This is the book that started it all for me. I read this was my first McCarthy novel, and I read it because I looked up on some sort of book site, like the top 50 antagonists, because people always want to read about the antagonists, not the protagonists. And one of the most highly qualified villains, one of the most ranked villains, is Mr. Judge Holden from Blood Meridian, and that's what led me to this book. And at the time I read it, I don't think I was prepared for it. I sort of skimmed through it the first time, so I went back and reread it, and that's when the references kicked in. That's when I sort of learnt more about the words. That's when I realised it was not so much a cowboy versus Indian story, but it was something more, something horrendous but beautiful at the same time. An epic novel of violence and depravity in the America's westward expansion. And it subverts the Western novel. It's an anti-Western, basically, an anti-Western, and it follows this 14-year-old kid, only known as the Kid, as he follows the Glanton gang on their massacre spree. And it also has an arc where it finishes full circle. The beginning starts with the Leonids, the meteor showers when the kid is born, and the ending features a meteor shower as well, so it goes full circle. The reference that I think people remember, the one that people talk about the most, is the one involving Paradise Lost, and it involves Judge Holden being found in the middle of the desert with guns, and then bringing him to a volcano in order to make a crude ammo from pissing on the sulfur. This is why they're being chased by Indians, and that is a reference to the devil in Paradise Lost bringing firepower to go to war with the angels and that. I haven't read Paradise Lost in a long time, so yeah, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But there are so many references in this. People call it a biblical cousin to Moby Dick, and I can see that straight away. It's basically a Nightmare Odyssey. So it's 352 pages. So it's not long, but it feels long because every word counts, every sentence is tight, drum tight. So yeah, this is a fantastic read. Released in 1985, and at the time of its release, it wasn't as anywhere near as well received as it was now. It sort of had a reappraisal in the early 2000s. Harold Bloom was one of the ones that sort of brought light to it, and now it's considered one of the greatest American books ever, and I agree. So that's Blood Meridian. Next we have the Water Trilogy. We got All the Pretty Horses, The Crossing, All the Pretty Horses I think was 92, The Crossing was 1994, and Cities of the Plain, which was 1998. Now unfortunately I can't talk much about The Crossing or Cities of the Plain because I have not read The Crossing, I've not read Cities of the Plain, and The Crossing I've only read the first 130 pages, but I can safely say that those 130 pages are phenomenal. And people always say that the book, which is structured as though it's a novella first and then a novel afterwards, and the novella involves a kid taking this she-wolf back to Mexico, and what follows is his treks in and out of Mexico after that. And that novella alone, if that story was released as a novella separate to the rest of the crossing, it'd be the best thing McCarthy ever did. But as it stands, it's released as a whole. It's a thick book. It's his second longest one at over 430 pages. And because I've only read the first 130, I will not count this amongst the rankings. But based on what I've read so far, it is phenomenal. So that's The Crossing. Bringing myself back to All the Pretty Horses, this is where he brought in an element of romanticism in John Grady Cole, who was a survivor of long generations of Texas ranchers, and finds himself going to Mexico with his friend Lacey Rawlins to work as a ranch hand. And not much more happens in that. It's more of a coming of age story, really, but the beautiful descriptions of Mexican wilderness and all that is what drew me to this. This was the book that kicked everything off for him. Before this book, none, and I mean none, of these ones sold more than a few thousand copies at the time. And then this one came out and sold, like 250,000 copies in the first few months or something like that of its release. It won him the National Book Award, and so since then everything kicked off. Yeah, he became a rich bastard. And there's not much more to say about that, really. It is an acknowledged masterpiece, and The Guardian calls it one of the greatest American novels of this or any time. So there's that. So that's All the Pretty Horses. I've not seen the movie yet with Matt Damon or Penelope Cruz, but I'm going to one day. So that's that. And that brings us to the third part of his prose change. First we had Southern Gothic, then we had the Westerns, and that brings us to these. We've got the neo-noir and the post-apocalyptic. I'm not so high on the road as most people are, but it's still a phenomenal read. It is probably the best post-apocalyptic novel I've ever read, and it's a quick read. It's structured so every sentence counts, and it has the best final paragraph of any of McCarthy's books. And those that have read it will know exactly what I mean. So I'm gonna read it now anyway. Once there were brook trout in the streams in the mountains. You could see them standing in the amber current where the white edges of their fins wimpled softly in the flow. They smelled of moss in your hand, polished and muscular and torsional. On their backs were vermiculate patterns that were maps of the world in its becoming, maps and mazes, of a thing that could not be put back, not to be made right again. In the deep glens where they lived, all things were older than man, and they hummed of mystery. Sorry, I sort of had a bit of thing in my throat there at the point. That does not spoil the book at all. It's its own separate thing to the story, but that final paragraph can be interpreted one of two ways if you're into the whole environmental thing. And it's a wonderful read, this one. This one here, people sort of go back and forth whether they prefer the movie or not. I personally prefer the book over the movie. Just goes a little bit more into that mythos of Anton Chigurh. And it's sort of structured as like a screenplay. I mean, from what I heard, it was written as a screenplay first and then released as a book with a bit more put into it. And you can tell why. It speeds along. It's fast. It's quick. You know, it's sort of this shootout of the South involving the Rio Grande and heroin and cash. So it's meant to be read like an American novel. So there's No Country for Old Men. Then we have his two plays. We got the Sunset Limited, which I have read, and The Gardener's Son, which I haven't read. This was the earlier one. I did read this one and I immensely liked it. I've only read a few plays, including A Streetcar Named Desire, but this one here, which is purely about two characters in an apartment called Mr. Black and Mr. White, who begin a conversation that leads through their own histories. My God, some of the conversations they have are amazing, and there's this conversation somewhere halfway through the book that involves books themselves and what they've read, and it's great. So there's that one there. So how would I rank this? Well, I don't know. In last place, it's got to be Out of Dark. Even if it is good, that just shows how much better everything else is. So it's going to go Out of Dark. Then after that, I'm going to rank Child of God. Then No Country for Old Men. Then coming in number 4, All the Pretty Horses. Then The Road. then Blood Meridian, then Suttree. Although I'd put Suttree and Blood Meridian together tied first, or move the rankings up and down any day of the week because they're both that good. But Suttree is a phenomenal read. I thought nothing could beat Blood Meridian, but this truly did it for me. It is a wonderful book, and all of his work is wonderful, and I highly recommend him. So hopefully that gives you an idea into his work, and hopefully I sold you on reading him. So yeah, thanks for everything, and have a good day.